Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that'll have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and hope that today's episode is one that you will find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get into our main event, for my people who are on YouTube, please make sure you hit the red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. If you are listening from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. Also, for those that would like to contribute financially to help us continue to build a platform, we have four pathways in which you can do that. The first is through Cash App with the handle $IDTALK4ED, Venmo with the handle @Kwame PayPal if you're online using the URL paypal.me/Kwame. And if you are a longtime subscriber, a longtime supporter of the podcast and all things Identity Talk, and you want to make a regular contribution, you can join the forum as an exclusive member. Over there, you'll get perks, behind the scenes footage of the podcast, some bonus content, and some other discounts associated with all the work we're doing. So to learn more about that, you can go to our main website at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. I'll say it one more time, IdentityTalk4Educators.com. And then for our readers, if you're looking for another book to add to your very extensive library, I'm assuming, make sure you add Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom. And this is a book that you want to have to start the year. If you are somebody that's all about affirming the different diverse identities of your students in your classroom, if you're about creating spaces of belonging where every student feels seen, welcome, and heard and affirmed, then this is the book that you want to have in your library space. To learn more about the book, you can go to the main website at learntorelearn.com. Also, if you are somebody who has ordered the book, you spread the word about the book to a friend, I want to thank you for your support and for continuing to spread the word. Now, for those who have yet to leave a review, it's not too late. You can either go to Goodreads, you can go to Amazon, or wherever you leave your reviews on books. Every word, every review is appreciated. It will help us to increase the visibility of this book across different platforms. So with that, I thank you all for your continued support. Now, let's get to the main event. So today we have another phenomenal guest. And this is somebody who I've been able to follow for a while. She has Philly connections just like I do, both coming from the same alma mater, Temple University. She is somebody who has an extensive career, starting off as a Spanish teacher, but now she's transitioned into leadership coaching. She's been a principal. She has trained many teachers, many school leaders, and she's still doing this work to this day. And on top of that, she's a doctor, y'all. She's a researcher. She is a scholar, and she is somebody that is all about the identity affirming work, the same work that we talk about on this podcast. So I don't want to waste any more time. I want to bring on Dr. Andrea Terrero Gabbadon to the podcast to talk about her work, what she does, and why she's here today. So let's bring Andrea on so we can have this conversation. Hello.
Hello.
How are we today?
Quite well, quite well. Thank you for the invitation to join this platform. I'm excited for our conversation today.
I'm excited as well. So there's so much to talk about, but we always like to start from the beginning so that people can know a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are. So I want to ask you this first question, which I like to ask everybody on this podcast. Who or what inspired you to want to become an educator to begin with?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to start off with. I think I became an educator because I wanted to be the person I knew I needed as a child in the K-12 system. I know we'll probably get to this, at later points, right? And I'll share more of my story, but my desire as an educator has always been, how can I be the change that I wish I had? How can I be the advocate that I wish I had access to? How can I be a bridge for others so that their reality and their futures are so much more full of possibility? I'm grateful for my own path, but I recognize it takes somebody to make that difference. And just like I had after K-12 great folks make a difference for me, I have to go back and be that educator to continue to pass on those opportunities, the example, the mentorship that I really needed as that younger person.
And speaking of being that younger person, we also are curious about what your K-12 schooling was like, because we know for a lot of us educators, a lot of how we look at the classroom and a lot of how we look at education is informed by that schooling that we received, whether it was good or bad or indifferent. So I'm curious to know how some of those experiences during that schooling allowed you to either come as your full self, or maybe there were times where you weren't able to fully embrace who you were.
Certainly. I think to answer that, first need to share a little bit of context around my K-12. I was someone who in the early 90s was one of very few kind of young people whose parents actually opted out of the formal kind of K-12 system. And I actually was homeschooled for many of my formative years.
Oh,
I
nice.
attended, homeschooling co-ops. I attended public school later on in my high school career. But again, really kind of a lot of shifting dynamics where across context, in many ways, I didn't feel a sense of like being seen. I didn't feel a sense of being affirmed. I knew decisions were made about my schooling, but there really wasn't a sense of agency in ways where the fullness of who I am, the complexity of who I am as a multiracial Latina, English, heritage speaker of Spanish as well. But like none of that was really elevated in ways where I could see it as being in synergy with schooling. And so, in terms of your question about embracing my identity and showing up as my full authentic self, regardless of the context I was in, I didn't really feel like I could show up as my full self. As a homeschooling kid, in the early 90s, being a brown face in a sea of a lot of like white, faces, right? There was those struggles of like, who am I? I don't look like the other kids around me. To fast forward going to public school, seeing other faces that were looking like me, but also experiencing what we know has been called like the bigotry of low expectation. And so, for me, it was very much, who am I? Where do I fit in? And like, what are my strengths and assets? Because no matter where I turned, regardless of context, there always felt like I could only show up in one way. And that would be based on like how the educators in front of me chose to see me, versus understanding, again, this multi-layered, multi-dimensional, dynamic person who just wants to be seen, loved, and affirmed.
Yeah. And at what point did you transition from the homeschooling setting into formal K to 12?
Yeah, it was not until 10th grade where I did like a transition year and like a hybrid program. And then 11th and 12th grade, I spent in a comprehensive public high school with tracking and very well-defined pathways for certain kids that aligned many times with socioeconomic status and race. And so you can imagine, for me, I'm not sure if you've seen like the movie Mean Girls, but there's this one scene where the main character transitions to her first day of public school after being homeschooled for a period of time. And for her, she describes it as like, a very kind of like foreign experience, right? Like, who are these
Yeah.
people as they're navigating? And that is spot on. That is the way I felt, as someone who, again, had always felt very othered in the K-12, I'm sorry, in the homeschooling space. But then again, fast forward, just because you see other kids that look like you, it doesn't eliminate that sense of othering. And so I think that speaks to like, how are we creating spaces where like the whole child is seen, understanding, right, that all of our babies and all of us as educators are multi-layered, and we have to hold space for all of that.
And as somebody that has been homeschooled for most of your K-12 life, looking at what's happening now, fast forwarding, do you look at homeschooling now as even a more viable option, given the things that are taking place within our school systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I grapple with certainly as
Yeah.
an educator. Again, I have committed my almost 20-year career at this point to public education because that is where most of our babies in America are, and that's where the service I think needs to happen. And what I've learned is history, right, tells us that American institution of public schooling was never meant to work, right? It was not designed, right, for children that look like us. So what does that mean? That means that homeschooling, private school, micro school, all of these school alternatives, I truly believe if they work for the kids, if they work for the families, then they are certainly worthy to be explored. I'm not one who like elevates one pathway over others. But again, I think to have a sole dedication to a system that was not built for the success of Black and brown children is foolish. And again, we have to think about what are the systems that are working? Where can we create those affirming spaces for our kids? But again, as an educator, I'm not just thinking about my own kids. I'm thinking about also all kids, which is again why I have committed, my education career within the public sector.
And speaking of your career, I know you're doing a lot of work with school leaders and you've been focusing a lot around leadership coaching, but you were in the classroom just like I was in the classroom. I was a math teacher, teaching middle school for almost 10 years. And then you started out as a Spanish teacher. So I'm wondering during those early years, what were some of the signs that you saw that led you to want to delve into the leadership realm?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. I think I'll say this. The reason why I became an educator was because I wanted to make a change, right, for kids that look like me. And what I'll
Right.
say is I learned so much more from those babies in Kensington than I potentially ever taught them.
Ooh, you were in
Um,
Kensington. Oh,
I was in Kensington,
you were in
yes, earned my
Kensington.
stripes. And it's funny because I just bumped into a former student just this past week, and she's a teacher now in the same neighborhood where she went to school and where I taught her. And so will say, right, like even for those of us who choose this career, like it's our babies who really transform our thinking and our pedagogy, right? And so your question around becoming a leader, I was actually initially approached to apply for an assistant principal role, and I rejected that request several times because I really loved the classroom. I really loved, high schoolers are my jam. I experienced such joy with them. And I am a systems thinker. I'm like routines, procedures, like how do we get stuff to work? That's always been how my brain is. And so when I was approached, I finally gave in because I saw that teachers are unable to do the work they love when the systems are not setting them up for success. So my entry into leadership was around how can we make this work better for educators so that they can continue to do the work that they love to do.
And I know you're up at Mastery. And for those who don't know about Mastery Charter Schools, a very popular network throughout Philly and also South Jersey area. When I was working at Russell Byers Charter School, we used to feed kids into the Lenfest campus down in Old City. So I don't know which campus were you on with Mastery.
Yeah, I'm a North Philly girl. Like all of
Oh,
my teaching and
yeah.
leadership has been in North Philly. My kids, up north, if you're from Philly, it's not north, it's
It's north.
Norf, North, North Philly, Badlands, Nicetown, Tioga. So I worked with
Uh-huh.
Mastery in a turnaround school up in North
Yep.
Philly. And that's where I spent the majority of my time in leadership as a turnaround assistant principal, as a director of curriculum instruction. And so, yeah, I actually don't live too far now from my former school. And so I see some of my former babies. And of course, they have babies and they have families and they're married and doing great things. And it just brings me so much joy to stay local, right? Like if we teach locally, awesome. But like, can we live where we teach so we can continue to be involved in our students' lives well after they leave our classrooms? It's been such a gift.
Amazing. And then during those formative years, what were some of the pivotal moments that helped to shape your own philosophy around equity, but also the concept of culturally affirming leadership, which you talk about extensively.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I would say three things. One, as leaders, we bring forth our own experiences as classroom educators into how we lead. One thing that has always been at the top of my mind as an educator was like, I want this to be something humanizing and sustainable, right? If I'm giving 100%, how can I exist within this fast-paced, outcomes-driven environment in ways that honors my humanity, honors my dignity, right? Doesn't devalue me as just a laborer, like someone who just does work, but a whole person with a whole life and who also loves children and wants to do great work with and for children. And so that's the first thing, right? Humanity. How can we create working conditions that are humanizing and sustainable for teachers? The second thing, certainly, that has influenced my thinking and my philosophy has been like, what does the data say? When we think about equity, equity shows up in data, right? Who school is working for, who school isn't working for, right? Curriculum, what curriculum is allowing certain kids to thrive, and who's the curriculum not working for, right? And so I think understanding and having access to data at a greater level as a leader allowed me to have a greater understanding of the ways in which equity is wound up in my work, whether I would like it to or not. And then the last piece is like stories of community members, stories of teachers, stories of students. I was one of those APs. I was always in a classroom. I would work in classrooms. I would always be, not obviously taking away from like a teacher's thunder, but like I'm talking to kids in the hallway, in lunchrooms, like building those relationships and understanding the student experience, I think is so key to understand, is school as we have designed it really working for our babies, right? And so those three things in combination, my story, the numbers, and the story of the people that we're serving, it gives me a greater urgency to make sure that school is working, right? That the systems that we've designed are benefiting those who we aim to serve.
Talk for Educators Live podcast is just one piece of the work that we do under Identity Talk Consulting, which we've had since 2019. And since then, we've had the privilege of working with 40 different schools, districts, and organizations across the globe. And we want to continue to add to that number in this new year. So if you are a school, if you're an educator or an organization that's looking to receive professional development and consulting services within any of our pillars, whether it's anti-bias, anti-racist practices, culturally responsive teaching, or identity affirming education, we are the firm for you, and we love to learn more about your needs. When you have a chance, make sure you go to our website at identitytalk4educators.com to learn more about our services and to schedule a discovery call today. We love to hear from you. And it's so amazing that you mentioned the data part, because a couple weeks ago, I had Shane Safir and Marlo Buxick, and they were talking about pedagogies of voice. And of course, they're talking about street data as well. So a lot of what you're talking about with regard to those metrics, the metrics that we tend to overlook, that may not be grades. It may not be discipline data. It may just be data that's focused on our students' backgrounds, the data that we tend to overlook and undermine for a myriad of reasons that we don't even have enough time to go over. So I appreciate you for bringing that up. We're in a really interesting time where still, post-pandemic, we have a lot of teachers, Black and brown teachers, who are leaving the field, and they're either transitioning to another position that's still within education but not in the classroom, or they're just exiting the profession altogether. And I've had people on this podcast share their own theories around why that is the case. But as somebody that's actually written a book that's focused around retention and also recruitment to a certain degree, how do we bring in great talent and keep them around? I'm wondering, with your book, Support and Retain Educators of Color, first off, what drew you to write the book, and what do you hope people will gain from reading the book?
I'll say this. In much of my work, there is this sense of my story continues to follow me. And even as I think about support and retain educators of color, the very early reasons as to why I wrote it really centered around my own story, right? The
Mhm.
story of why I came to teaching, the story of why I love teaching, and the story of things that happened within my school ecosystem that influenced me to think about, is this a career that I can continue in? Now, again, almost 20 years later, I'm still in education. It is the work that I'm called to do. But what we don't understand is that so many educators, particularly educators of color, who continue to leave teaching at higher rates than white teachers, are carrying with them stories of workplace oppression, of identity-based harm, of microaggressions, and of racial battle fatigue that they have sustained for years, 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 years. And those are experiences that unfortunately many times causes them to think about other career pathways. We haven't done a good job as leaders, either school leaders or system leaders, in creating schools as humanizing places, places that honor and center folks' identity. And unfortunately, the consequence of that is when we have harm happening in schools, harm that
Yeah.
causes people to leave. And so until we as leaders grapple with the reality that schools are just a microcosm of the real world, until we choose to understand that the very foundation of school continues to work for some while continuing to cause harm to others, we'll never be able to address this issue. So the book, Support and Retain Educators of Color, is really
Yes,
just
hold it up.
around, yes, yes. It's really about how do we rethink teaching to be a space that acknowledges the realities of race and racism and what has done in schools, and then create a different possibility for teachers that influences them to stay. And it's really easy. It's around acknowledging, grappling with the reality of race and racism, dismantling the ways in which that shows up in policy and practice, and creating support, right? Because our educators, at the end of the day, they come in because they want to make a change. We have to support them to be able to do the work that they want to do. And ultimately, when we support folks well, they stay.
And that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is around psychological safety. And I think this is something that we could both relate to as teachers of color, being Black and brown teachers. I feel like when we get into the field, initially as classroom teachers, we already feel like what we're supposed to do goes way beyond our job description on the contract. So when we talk about the invisible tax and the extra responsibility, the heavier burden that we carry in order to yield the same results as our non-melanated counterparts, if you will. I'm wondering, just from your own perspective as a leadership coach, what does it look like to build psychological safety for Black or brown educators who have experienced racial battle fatigue because of things that I just mentioned, the overextending of self and the need to do more than what is required according to what the contract states.
Mm-hmm. It's three things, right? So, one, listen. You've named already, Kwame, the reasons why teachers leave, right? We talked about that additional burden, the additional unpaid labor, right? The ask to translate, the ask to have a child with a perceived, right, disciplinary challenge come into our classroom, or the pressure that is placed on us. Oh, you're the best one who connects with this family member, right? Or this
Mm-hmm.
element of our school community. You're the best one to do it, right? But all of this is unpaid additional labor within a context that continues to racialize the educator, right? And so instead of building up the capacity of other educators, what we're asking for educators of color to take on are unpaid additional tasks, while at the same time, those educators are experiencing identity-based harm, racial microaggressions, and others. And so again, what can leaders do? They can listen, right? Listen, because when we say these things that the research shows, I guarantee you there is someone within your school context, and that is their reality, right? And so if I could tell any, leaders who are listening to this, it's like, are you listening to the things that teachers are saying? And if teachers aren't saying anything, then you probably have not set up systems where they can actually share their stories, or there's something within your leadership that is causing them to be tight-lipped, right? And so there have to be certain conditions in place, but at the core, we need to listen to the stories of our educators around what they need and what they are experiencing in the day-to-day context. The second thing is believe.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot legitimize or rationalize the things that we hear. We have to hold space for folks' lived reality. Their perception, their experience is their reality.
That's
And
right.
so many times as a leader, they feel like this because of this, or they don't understand. They feel like this because, well, this other educator is less experienced. And like, I get all that, right? Like there are reasons, there's complex factors, I understand. But when your teachers are saying help, and I need help because I am experiencing X, Y, Z, you have to believe that experience and take it seriously. And then the last thing is you have to respond, right?
Mm.
And I think, that's why I wrote the book. People were like, well, how do I respond? So I literally wrote out like principles that allow you to respond to the data you collect from teachers, ways in which you can change policy and or practice. But at
Yeah.
the end of the day, we can't create these spaces for teachers to share their stories and not believe them or not respond, right? And so the 3-part framework has to be in place, because what happens, and this goes back to this idea of like psychological safety, then my workplace becomes unsafe. Why am I sharing my story? You're essentially gaslighting me. And so if we want to reverse that trend, listen, believe, and you have to respond.
There it is. Now we're going to get a little granular now, because you just talked about the 3-part framework, but your book focuses on 6 culturally affirming leadership principles. And we don't have all the time in the world to go in depth with all 6 of them. So I'm going to ask you a question which may be difficult to answer. Now, of the 6 principles that you state within the book, which of those leadership principles do you believe school leaders have the most difficulty executing in their respective settings?
Being the true educator that I am, I would have to say, like, it really goes down to the first principle:
Mm.
acknowledging educator diversity matters. Let me break it down a little bit. So when we think
Yep.
about educators of color, the argument is often, well, teachers of color, educators of color are underrepresented. While over 50% of kids in American public school are students of color, Black, Indigenous, other peoples of color, our educator workforce is really only about 20%, right? And so then the argument goes from there, well, teachers of color are good for kids of color, right? When we have teachers of color, students of color thrive. And we kind of go from there, and all of that is true, right? It's well documented that Black students thrive when they have at least one Black teacher by the 3rd grade. They are more likely
Right.
to graduate from their K-12. They're more likely to enter post-secondary education, and they're more likely to graduate. But what we often overlook with that argument is the fact that educators of color are good for all kids. There's one powerful study that was done a couple years ago where they actually did, it was a couple of thousand students that were asked to rank their favorite or preferred educators and to explain why. And this is a quantitative study, mind you. And what the study found was that Black educators were actually preferred more highly than any other ethno-racial group.
Mm-hmm.
When the researchers looked as to why, it really wasn't necessarily around race, but all kids preferred Black teachers because those teachers had higher expectations, the work was more challenging, and they also experienced higher levels of support with completing challenging work. How does this connect back to acknowledge that educator diversity matters? Because as a nation, we have to grapple with the fact that having a diverse educator workforce is good for all kids. And educators of color, this might be, controversial, But let's say there wasn't a statistical difference. Let's say that white educators and educators of color had the same level of impact with students. Why do we need to make a unique case for the humanity of educators of color? And so
That's
what I
right.
say in this first principle is that educators of color matter. Educator diversity matters. Why? Not because they're good for kids of color, not because we're good for all kids, but the reality is that we need a more diverse educator workforce, and we need to honor the realities, the lived experiences, and the humanity of educators of color, because they're people who are worthy of dignity, who are worthy of love, who are worthy of being in a system which they can show up freely as themselves to do the work that they want to do, point blank. And so again, going back to school leaders, is that your general disposition around educators of color? Are you honoring their dignity? Or, and I'm in spaces where, well, I really focus on educators of color because of these narrow reasons, because they're good for kids. Like, yes, that's true. But what we have to be careful with is, are we, in elevating the benefits of educators of color, are we potentially pigeonholing them when we're now saying, well, because you're good, now you're going to be over disciplined? Or are we saying now you're going to be in charge of this group of students? Or now you have these unpaid, responsibilities where you're developing these cultural bridges with family
Right.
because you speak a certain language. But again, it's not about stereotyping or fitting people into roles, but saying, you're a person. I can support you to be awesome. I want you to thrive as a professional. You are worthy of every element of support that any other educator in my building has access to. What can I do to make sure that this is a place where you can thrive?
Are you ready to take your commitment to identity affirming education to the next level? Then join the forum, the new and exclusive membership space for the Identity Talk community. With membership tiers starting at $3 a month, you'll get early access to podcast episodes, bonus content, our Quam's Quotes monthly newsletter, and monthly live Q&A sessions. You'll also unlock discounts on workshops and products, engage in community discussions, access exclusive community and networking opportunities, and even business ad roles during episodes if you're a sponsor level member. Whether you're an ally, advocate, co-conspirator, accomplice, or a sponsor, there's a place for you in the forum. So head over to identitytalk4educators.com/pricing plans/list and join the movement today. And I want to ask you this, Andrea, because I've talked to people on this podcast about the things that they believe lead to this recurrent issue of recruiting more teachers of color, and more importantly, keeping them around, retaining them. So, what's your theory around that? Do you believe that it's something that's around the marketing? Do we need to improve the marketing of the profession so that people can see how cool it is? Like you and I were talking on the podcast, we're educators, but we're doing it in a way that's a bit more swaggy compared to what people may think an educator entails, right? What do you believe are the barriers that are still preventing us from addressing this issue? Because we see our guy, Sharif El-Mekki, shout out to Sharif, going around the country talking people's head off about this issue. I've had leaders come on this podcast to talk about the same issue. So what's missing still?
Yeah, unfortunately, education is just not an attractive career pathway, right?
Yeah.
And part of that is, to your point, right? There's, and shout out. There's an excellent educator I've worked with, named Reed, and he talks about, part of his work as a Black male educator in Philly schools has been walking in with a certain level of swag in ways that convince his students to be like, wait, now that I've observed you, I think about teaching differently. Right. But there's this idea that we have to make teaching more attractive, not just with pay, not just with having working conditions and facilities that are on par, right, with other career pathways, right? We need to think about schooling the way that we've done it 100 years ago isn't going to work, right, for this next generation of professionals who want more flexibility and more options with not just where they work, but how they work.
Mm-hmm.
We also go, thinking about pedagogy, right? we as as a sector have done a poor job elevating the ways in which pedagogy is so powerful, right? So when I think back to my time at my alma mater, whether it was at Temple, whether it was at Penn, right? Like we never talked about the subversive tactics of the Black teaching tradition in which education and literacy was seen as a pathway for socio-political empowerment. Like we weren't having those conversations. Again, going back to Sharif, dope guy, I love him. Some of the work that he's done at the Center for Black Educator Development is helping young people understand that pedagogy is political and it's powerful. And he does that through exposing young folks, through the freedom schools model to how education has been used again for community uplift and empowerment. And so those are the conversations that we need to have. That's how we need to rebrand education, right? It's both the policy through improving the mechanics and the career pathways and the salary of teaching, but then it's also just showing young people it's not just about teaching to the curriculum. It's not just about teaching to the script, but rather there is a whole legacy. And I talk about it in my book, which again, when you talk about educators of color, you can't ask us to teach our historical or leave rather our historical ways of teaching at the door, right? I come from a people group that has used education as a way of uplift. We lift as we climb. And so when you are thinking about how do we make teaching attractive, it's about saying to young people, hey, you want to make a social change? You want to make sure that, Philly becomes a more equitable city where all kids have a pathway, where their voice has power and momentum, right? You want to be part of this powerful political change? Well, become a teacher. We're not having those conversations. And so until we change the way we talk about the work, the ways that we highlight the possibilities of the work, we're going to see ourselves continue to be here in terms of recruitment.
Yeah, and let's go deeper. So I want to talk about our school leadership preparation programs. And I'm going to let you hold your magic wand for this question. So if you had the ability to redesign the programs, what are some experiences and slash or content that you would hope that future leaders that come down the pipeline are equipped to have so that they can better support Black and brown educators in their future schools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate as someone who does teach aspiring school leaders to implement some of the changes. The first one I'll say is we have to create spaces for critical reflection, right? We have to create affinity-based spaces where folks of similar ethno-racial and other identity-based groups can come together and think about where are they situated within this work of leadership. What does that mean? So right now, one of the projects that I have going on, and we're moving into our second year, is this idea of a racial caucus group. And so I work with a local university, and we have caucus groups for white identifying educators, white males, white women, Black educators, Black all gender, hoping to expand into other ethno-racial and identity-based groups, such as having a group for like Jewish educators, queer educators, etc. But the purpose of these groups really is to grapple with who am I as a leader? What have been my experiences? In what ways, how have I interacted with power and privilege, or how have I experienced marginalization within my school context? And over the course of the year, we take those conversations, not just from thinking about someone's own experience as someone in the education ecosystem, but then as a leader, particularly as you're engaging a site-based internship, how are you showing up, right? What does your identity look like? How are you engaging and interacting? What does it mean with who are you holding space for? Who are you inviting to have a seat at the table? And conversely, who's not at the table? And so there are really these kind of critical, they're crucial conversations, as you will, that span the year and really allow folks to think introspectively around their engagement with power and identity and marginalization. And the data has come back saying like folks need this space, right? The ways that like white educators particularly going into urban settings, might experience power and leverage power and think about equity is very different, potentially, than a Black educator, right? And so they need those spaces, again, to think about who are they, how are they engaging with the community, what does it look like with their decision making. And the beauty of those spaces is iron sharpening iron. And so really pushing each other to think about those decisions that they're making, those people who are there allowing to have a seat at the table and those that aren't. And they look at data and case studies and really grappling with, again, their work as emerging leaders within this context. And so that's something I wish every school leadership program had. The second thing I would say is a greater kind of socio-political understanding of the history of schools. We
Yeah.
mentioned earlier in our conversation, schools were designed to privilege some at the expense of others, right? When we think about public schooling, started more commonly in the North. There was a lot of resistance in the South. It was actually Black educators and Black politicians that helped advocate, right, for the expansion of
Right.
public school in the South. And so
Yes.
I think when we learn more deeply the history of schooling as leaders, it changes our thinking around who is education actually meant to benefit, and in what ways are there lingering effects of that within my context. Whether it's a public school or a private school, we need to really grapple with, again, the reality of history, because we know history is not this far detached thing, but there's always these after effects. And so how are people acknowledging that history, willing to understand the implications nowadays? And then, again, going back to this context of racial caucus groups, how are we working together with folks who have similar interests, similar bent towards equity, to think about what does it look like to dismantle and replace these systems so that we have systems that really center and benefit those who have been historically marginalized or intentionally excluded from schools.
And that's a very important point. And I also believe it's the reason why your book is so important. And not to be up on your business, but I'm pretty sure most of the readers, or a good majority of them, are probably white school leaders who are purchasing your book because there's an awareness around this very fact that you're mentioning. Like they have an awareness that, all right, we really need to hammer down this issue. We really need to build capacity and context around how our decisions impact the personal and educational lives of our Black and brown students. So all that to say, I'm glad that there's more of an awareness, but we have to do more.
Yeah.
Now we got to translate it into action. That's going
Yes.
to be the next step, is doing that. Now, as you were talking about the racial caucus groups, and I love how the conversation is flowing. And this is actually a good way to start to wrap things up, because the main reason why people come on this podcast is because they're able to share stories that they're just not able to share in their respective school environments. So, in essence, this is kind of like a virtual affinity group. It's like a virtual racial caucus group, honestly, because most of the guests are people of color, and more specifically, they're women of color, because we know that the sexism and a lot of the misogyny that happens within our space, unfortunately, is what impacts them, and they're not able to come in as their full selves. But not to get off a tangent, I want to end with this question before we wrap up. So, you've given us a chance to delve into your story as an educator and as a school leader. Now, what I want to know is, even now, as you're working with different school leaders, how do you stay true to the teacher in you?
While it may seem cliche, I'm very clear on my why. I'm very
Mm,
clear on what I do and who I do it for. And that is, I'm a multiracial Latina, Spanish speaker. I'm a mother, right? Like there's so many parts of me. And as someone who is deeply rooted in the community that I aim to serve, a community that some would maybe disregard, but we are fighting gentrification, right? We're fighting to maintain our cultural roots. Like I know why I do this work. And so when I think about how do I stay true to education, like I do it for like Black and Latinx children, in my community, in my city. And even when I travel abroad, I always think about who has schooling not worked for in this context. Like, I do it for you. And when I think about teachers, I think about who's underrepresented in this space, right? How can we grapple, right, with the realities of anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, anti-queerness, like those that feel like they may not have a voice in this space? Like, I'm here for you. That is why I do this work. And I don't drink other people's Kool-Aid, right? I've worked for various entities, and I work to further people's goals, and that's all good. But like, that is not the why that encourages me, that wakes me up those early mornings, that keeps me up late at night. Like, it is a sincere, laser-like focus on communities that are dear to my heart, for those that have been excluded, marginalized. And, I just want to see us do better. I think that's really what it's about at the end of the day. Again, as cliche it may seem, that's my why. And I make that abundantly apparent with the folks that I work with. And I think unless we, I'm grateful and privileged that I've worked in contexts where, people understand that I'm unapologetic, and I'm getting to the point in my career where folks are like, yeah, just let her do her. And, I could make a little noise, but that's privilege, right? That's privilege. Not everyone can do that.
Right.
And so for those that are like, well, I know who I do it for, but people are coming at me, right? It's just keep pushing. And like, just find those who are in your corner that will help you stay connected to that why. Find those children, find those community members, connect with those folks online, connect with podcasts like yours where your story is resonant. Because at the end of the day, I feel like I wouldn't have stayed this long if I wasn't super clear on, who I am and why I do this work.
And that's a word right there. Now, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. And please, before you go, I want to make sure you have a chance to let people know how they can connect with you on social media. And also, feel free to share about your consulting services that you provide, because it is a new school year. People are trying to get clients. So I want to give you a chance to, do your thing there.
Appreciate you. Right. So folks can follow me LinkedIn under my name, Andrea Terrero Gabbadon. I'm on Instagram, atgabbadon_PhD. But if you want to connect me, if you want to work with me, if you perceive that you need help creating a school environment that affirms, supports, and retains educators, particularly educators of color, connect with me. Go to my website, atgabbadon.com. Again, that's atgabbadon.com. Fill out an inquiry. Love to work with folks. And if you can't do that, I get it. At the end of the day, there's always my book. I believe we need to build folks' capacity to do this work. And so that's why I wrote the book. It's literally designed to help leaders support and retain staff, even if you don't have access to the PD, even if you don't have access to me. Again, this is a great resource, walks you step by step. How do you create that school culture that supports and retains staff? And maybe you're thinking like, oh, well, I don't have many educators of color. Look, when we are redesigning systems that benefit those that are underrepresented, everybody benefits. And so if you want to talk about retaining staff, this still is an excellent resource for you.
All right. You heard it from the good doc here on this podcast. So thank you all again for tuning in to another episode of IDTALK for Educators Live. And on behalf of Dr. Andrea Terrero Gabbadon, I'm wishing you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.